Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Kat White, the Director of Collections at the Stowe Center for Literary Activism, where we seek to encourage social justice and literary activism by exploring the life and legacy of Harriet Beecher Stowe and all who advocated hope and freedom then and now. Each year, we award our Stowe Prize for Literary Activism to a book that embodies and inspires the values of advocating for justice, equity in a society which values and welcomes everybody. Our 2024 Stowe Prize winner was Dr. Bettina Love for her book, Punished for Dreaming, which exposed the racism and harm inherent to many policies that inform our education system and laid out a plan to work towards education justice. We recognize that this issue, education justice and equity, is incredibly relevant to Hartford and impacts all learners as well as their families and communities. And so we are diving deeper into the topic of education justice with the Stowe Prize series of programs. I am very pleased to host this conversation with people who are deeply invested in this topic and to have you all here with us both in person and online. Our organizer and moderator for the evening is Dr. Anthony De Jesus. Dr. De Jesus is an associate professor in the Department of Social Work and Equitable Community Practice and director of the MSW program at the University of St. Joseph in West Hartford. Dr. De Jesus previously served as an assistant professor at the Silberman School of Social Work and a researcher and interim director at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College, CUNY. He teaches courses on research and culture, diversity and human rights, and has conducted research on workforce development and culturally responsive services in community-based mental health, child welfare, and youth services. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Kat, for that lovely introduction. It's really a pleasure to collaborate with you and the Stowe Center again in an event that really aligns with the mission of the Stowe Center and the tradition, the great tradition in our country of abolitionism and justice, which is infused in our social work profession. It's the first week of March. March is Social Work Month. NASW, National Association of Social Workers, has emphasized the connection for social work between action and compassion as our theme for Social Work Month. This week is also School Social Work Week. And so it's really fitting that we have chosen this week to have the panel. I have to say that I was not aware that it was School Social Work Week, but it's one of those great coincidences. And that my own career as a social worker began in schools as a school social worker in the city of Boston. And those experiences working in schools perplexed me, exhilarated me, infuriated me, generated deep questions in me around why schools could be such fantastic places and such fucked up places in terms of the way that kids were treated, the way they experienced schools, and what the outcomes were. Those experiences in Boston led me on a journey that's brought me to tonight, where I was interested in understanding the roles and the possibilities. In order to understand the possibilities, I learned you also have to understand the constraints of school social workers for being involved in making change in the lives of individual students, their families, and their communities. And that necessitated, ultimately, for me, understanding the ways in which we are involved in shaping school structures and interventions that we're gonna speak about tonight. And so, in many ways, organizing this panel has been an opportunity for me to come full circle in my career as a school social worker and as a social work educator. And that has a lot to do with the panelists who I'm just really privileged that they've agreed to participate tonight, who all also are social work educators, accomplished social work educators, and practitioners, former school social workers whose work also motivated the research questions that generated their dissertation studies. One of them's going to be defending their dissertation in a few weeks. And the themes of our work really reflect resilience and restoration, really are seeking to provide hope in settings that sometimes don't generate hope, or certainly under conditions and a political and historical climate that that everyone is experiencing as tremendously challenging. That's part of the reason that we organized this panel. It's also the last class session for the social work practice in schools course in our MSW program at the University of St. Joseph. So I want to acknowledge the accomplishments of those students who are here tonight in person and online. This is their professor, Professor Heather Lassell. One of our panelists is assistant professor at University of St. Joseph, former school social worker, former child welfare worker, clinician, clinical social worker, and owner of Connecticut Kids Matter, a very important private practice working with young people and families in Connecticut, and an advocate for school social work, a leader in school social work, who has spearheaded the establishment of a new school social work specialization in our MSW program. And the course that the students here tonight are completing is certifying or making them eligible for school social work certification in the state of Connecticut. So we're very proud of that, and we want to I want to thank you, Dr. Lassell. So Dr. Lassell will be the first presenter, followed by the soon-to-be Dr. Bianca de Bellis, who is a former New York City school teacher and New York City school social worker, a doctoral student, a PhD candidate at the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work, and somebody who there has participated under the mentorship of Dr. Jay Hughley and others in developing important evidence-based interventions oriented around restorative justice principles and approaches. So those are really key and speak to the importance of developing an evidence base that informs restorative practices and the work that we do in schools to reduce retributive, punitive, and exclusionary disciplinary practices and educational practices in schools. So I'm excited about Bianca's contributions, and in the fall, Bianca will begin as an assistant professor at the Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College, which is kind of like my alma mater because that's where I taught, that's where I learned to be a social work educator. And another shout out, that's also where I met my dear friend and mentor, Phyllis Solomon, whose sister Barbara's here tonight, and grew up in Hartford. So we want to make sure that we recognize Hartford and its contributions to social work. Finally, I want to go from Hartford back to the Bronx, which is where I grew up. It's also where Dr. Cindy Bautista Tomas grew up and where she teaches as an assistant professor at Lehman College in the MSW program there. I'll mention that all three of these MSW programs that we've mentioned, Silberman School of Social Work, Lehman College School of Social Work, and USJ, all have a long tradition of, from the beginning, starting out focusing on supporting working adults to complete their MSW. I don't know enough about Pittsburgh, but Bianca will make a shout out as appropriate. But Dr. Cindy Bautista Tomas was also a school social worker, was involved in field education at the Columbia School of Social Work, completed her PhD at the CUNY Graduate Center in Urban Education. So like myself, has bridges educational research and social work research and education. Cindy is an inspirational speaker, leader, researcher, and is going to really introduce us to concepts that will broaden our conceptions of self-care and understand community care and really kind of bring us to a place that will ground us and support us in moving forward and implementing resilient and restorative practices in our work in schools and beyond. So I want to just kind of make one final full circle observation or recognition for me, and that is that one of our graduating students this year, who is online, is somebody who I met when I was a school social worker working in a school in Boston, and whom I've had a lifelong relationship with since the early 90s. And he himself is going to be graduating and pursuing school social work employment in the greater Boston area. And so I want to just acknowledge Danny Quiles in the audience and say that it's a real milestone for me in my career to kind of see school social work really play that kind of role in this important personal and professional relationship for me. So with that, I give you Dr. Lasad.
Technical thing here.
Oh, you're moving that.
There she is. And I am gonna bring up just the speaker. Hopefully.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, thank you everybody for being here tonight. It's nice to see some of my students who I only get to see online in person. So thank you. Thank you for being here. For me, I initially began my education journey as a school social worker. And so I look at history, and it's very important that we're here in this space when we think about where we came from to help to inform where we are now and where we want to go. So, yeah, thank you. So thinking about Connecticut and framing sort of the history and the context of United States education, we were the second state after Massachusetts to begin with public education. And what we know through history is that radical movements and really progressive ideas shaped the way in which we educate children in our country. So initially saying, hey, we're going to have free public education for all students. And at the time, that was really radical. Let me frame white students, right? And so white children. Then as we started to see shifts, right, with movements with war, with the progressive education movement saying, hey, we want a literate population, we started to see some changes. We started to see the establishment in the South of the Freedmen's Bureau, and we started to see some movement towards education. There was still a large illiteracy rate in Black and brown population. Only about 10% at that point were literate. And then as we move through the eras, progressive education, really starting to have curriculum built for children and a framework as to how we're going to teach. We then move into the Great Depression, and that really shifted how we're going to teach, what we're going to teach to children, meeting vocational needs at that time. And so we started to really see that training built into the education system. And fast forward, a really progressive time, right? In history, lots of tension, the civil rights movement, seeing that systemic racism, seeing a large push for desegregation in schools. We saw groundbreaking, court cases with Brown versus Board of Education and how that impacted the education system across the country. Then we look at post 9/11 and movements around tolerance and diversity and how we respond in classrooms across the country. It's different depending on what area we're talking about geographically, but how we respond to fear and uncertainty. And a push towards a global world. And then, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, and that really highlighted gaps. I saw here in Connecticut, just the zip code that you were in really determined the resources that were available. And so throughout all of this, we know that there's these tensions. We know that there's a socioeconomic and socio-political framework that has really pushed and shaped the work that is happening in schools. So that's important to know, bless you. The next thing that's important to know as we look at history is how this perception of power and knowledge through having an education was used and limited, right? So thinking about going back in history, slave owners were really against educating slaves because they believed that that meant that they would become disobedient and unruly. And then as we move through history and the Emancipation Proclamation, we started seeing that shift that I spoke about, where there was a movement towards becoming more literate and having opportunities, right, in some spaces for diverse populations to receive education. And we saw large change by the 1940s, about 89% access to education. That said, a lot of segregation, and we know right here in Hartford, we are like ground zero with Sheck versus O'Neill, dating back to 1989, and that lawsuit really said, even though Brown versus Board of Ed, looked at desegregating schools and doing that with deliberate speed, right, is that by the 80s, we were still very segregated, and some argue today we're very segregated as to the resources and the opportunities that are available to kids in Connecticut, sometimes a mile apart from each other, right, and the types of schooling and education they receive. And then looking at gender, and before 1972, high schools were segregated often by sex. So we were seeing, girls and boys being educated separately. So thinking about that context and then looking at where we are, the history, this is Connecticut educators. Now, all educators include administrative staff, principals, and school social workers. So the blue is white individuals, and it's primarily who makes up the Connecticut education workforce. You can see the yellow is Hispanic and the gray are Black and African American. So we know that research speaks to the importance of having representation in schools, having educators that look like you and look like communities and are representative of communities. And this is where we stand. So the blue are educators of color in Connecticut. So we're doing better than we were a few years ago, and there's been a lot of funding, initiatives, resources, and supports, particularly around teachers, not as much around school social workers, but particularly around bringing in diverse teachers. But 52.5% of our students are students of color. And so we have still a huge gap in representation. And when we specifically look at social workers, it's even larger. The majority of school social workers are white women from suburban areas. So thinking about that, we have to frame what are the disparities in education here in our state. And we have to talk about, tonight we're gonna talk about hope, but we gotta talk about kind of the reality of where things are, right? And these are graduation rates in Connecticut. 93.4% of students graduate high school in 4 years, white students. When we break that down by Black and Hispanic students, we look at this huge achievement gap. It's about 81.7% Black student graduation rate, 81.1% Hispanic. So that's a significant gap in being able to provide. We know that when we have these gaps, then there's inequities in access to resources and in long-term socioeconomic output and opportunities. So this is a hard slide for me because this is a real slide. I know my students have seen it before, but it's something, that room, those 3 pictures is one room. It's in a school district here in Connecticut. I took that in 2019. As a clinical practitioner, I treat children with, often that come to me with behavioral challenges. And as I tell my students, behavior is just a communication. It's a symptom, right? That's communicating an unmet need. So I had a little girl who was about 8 years old, who was coming to me clinically because she was struggling with attending school, getting up and running around on the bus, wetting her pants, those sorts of things. And I decided I'm going to go to the school and meet her. And she was spending most of her day in this room that was called the opportunity room. She asked me if she could show me it. She says, before you go, I met with her in a different room. She said, before you go, can I show you the opportunity room where I spend a lot of my day? And so I said, okay. And she brings me to this room. There's not a desk. I mean, you can't put adult incarcerated men who have lifetime sentences in segregation in this way for as long as they were placing her. And this is public education. So I took these photos and I did bring them to the State Department of Ed and 8x10 and make sure every single one of the board members had a copy of them. And I said, this is just unacceptable. If it was my child, I wouldn't allow her to attend another day in school in this environment. And I really grappled with having conversations with the school social worker as to how they ethically work within this system, knowing that kids are, losing educational opportunities and really placed in seclusion in this way. So we have a lot of work to do in Connecticut. We know that our littlest people are being suspended and excluded from schools. We know that Black and brown kids are secluded, expelled, suspended at higher rates than their white peers. And that Connecticut is 3rd worst, despite all of the wealth and resources that we have here, 3rd worst in the country for education equality based on race. So looking at those graduation rates, test scores between white and Black residents, and we're last in the country for disparity in college bachelor's degrees. So once we graduate, like what happens next and supporting students onto higher education. And then we look at those funding gaps, and there's a $639 million between districts that have students that are predominantly Black and brown. So they're not being funded in the same ways because our districts are often funded a lot by tax dollars locally. And then looking at the state of the state in regards to mental health needs. So in looking at the about 500,000 students that we have, we know that we have a high incidence of students with adverse childhood experiences. We know that many students now, especially since the pandemic, are struggling with major depression and depressive episodes, school refusal. And this is where social workers are so needed, because we're not just looking at the symptom, we zoom out and we say, what else is going on in their world? What else is going on in all of our worlds? Where are the tensions? What's happening in the community and in their family? And we know that there's gaps with these 39,000 students, and those are ones that are identified, right, with a major depressive episode in the last year, that only 24,000 students receive treatment. That's thousands of students who have not received the treatment that they need. Many of our schools are operating with so the average in Connecticut is 1 school social worker for every 536 students. The NASW, so our national accrediting body, recommends 1 to 250, unless we're talking about students that meet special education needs, then that's 1 to 50. And so we're far outreaching. We had a social worker, school social worker that came to our class and spoke, and she's in a school of over 800 students and the only social worker. So thinking about the students and their environments, right? As social workers, again, we're not just looking at a child who's disruptive. We're not just looking at that behavior. How many times are they out of their chair? But really looking at this circle around them, their environment, their family, their friends, their peers, their neighborhood, their felt safety and belonging, the school climate, the laws, the current socio-political context, right? And all of that history and attitudes, norms that influence and impact how we respond to students and how they feel within school culture and climate. So thinking about trauma-informed education, that is absolutely my jam. Is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is psychology 101 stuff, is that kids need to feel safe and they need to be fed and have shelter and have basic needs. And when they don't have those things, they view the world as a threatening place. We know kids are coming through the doors of schools every morning and they're dealing with traumas that they're experiencing in their lives, in their communities, and sometimes even in their schools. And that negatively impacts their behavior. But how can we take that knowledge, especially as social workers, and say, we're aware of the neuroscience, we're aware that their bodies and minds are responding or not responding because they're hungry or because they're not feeling safe or they don't feel like they belong or they're not feeling seen. And we can't get to higher level learning and test scores if we're not building that foundational base for them. So thinking about really shifting the idea of building connection or relationship in schools, there's some great strategies and interventions that are super simple and don't cost lots of money. Greeting students at the door, looking at people in the eye and saying, I'm so glad you're here and you're important to me. Getting to know students, their interests, their families, their lived lives and situations, and focusing on their social and emotional needs first. We all come in with those feelings, whether that's anxiety, whether it's hunger, whether they're tired, and recognizing and acknowledging and validating those feelings and helping them to meet those basic needs before we move on is how we build community and belonging, how we build felt safety in schools, teaching coping skills. That's really important. We all need them. I think that we're all kind of a work in progress in shifting and coping with new challenges. And so being able to model that and teach it is really important. And pivoting away from those punitive practices that are historically rooted in our schools, rejecting students. How many of us were sent out of the classrooms to stand in the hall, or your desk had to be turned around, right? That's really rejecting and shaming and not a way to build community and felt safety and belonging. So thinking about the ways that we can do that are really critical. And then how can we support educators? I have to believe that educators come into education, the field of education, because they really want to help kids. But we also know that kids are dealing with so much these days that we need to be able to support educators. And some of that comes from social workers understanding the community, understanding the kids and the families, getting to know what those needs are, and then being able to bring that back and inform the teachers and model for the teachers. Having the teachers really reflect on, what's my goal here? Is my goal, that I need the student only to know what 1 + 1 is? Or is my goal to have them feel as though they can accomplish this, right? And have the self-esteem to take on new tasks or challenges. So I think.
Thank you.
We all know I'm not short.
Bianca,
Should I just jump in?
please jump in.
Yeah. So thinking about the structural inequities that Dr. LaSalle just shared, to reduce disparities in exclusion, restorative practices emerged in school settings. And restorative practices are really a whole school community, school climate model, and it prioritizes relationships, community, accountability, And a lot of times people hear restorative practices, and I think that they think of how we respond to harm, but it is much more than just when harm occurs, this is how we're responding. It's really a community, a whole school climate model. And sure, it practices on preventing harm and resolving conflicts, but through having a culture of respect and inclusion and shared responsibility. And the shift away from exclusionary discipline is instead having kids talk and understand maybe what might have happened and move towards healing rather than exclusion. And so part of this understanding is that behavior is a form of communication. And as educators in restorative communities or social workers generally, I think we want to understand why students may behave in some ways that might seem inappropriate, because these behaviors that kids are showing us are trying to tell us something. And rather than punishing them, we want to explore them in restorative spaces, because we want to understand if these behaviors are a manifestation of kids having unmet needs so that we can meet them. Are they hungry? Let's get them a snack. Kind of like what Dr. LaSalle was sharing. In a lot of ways, restorative practices are trauma responsive. Are they experiencing trouble at home? Should we connect them to the school social worker? If a kid is acting out in class, instead of sending them out, it more just looks like conferencing with them and saying, hey, you seem like super, excuse me, sorry. You seem super unfocused today. That's really out of character for you. Like, what's going on? And you'd be surprised how much kids have to share when you give them the opportunity to. So whatever may be surfacing, you really seek to understand and repair however you can in a restorative space. And JDP is a project that I work on that serves over 7,000 students in Pittsburgh public schools, and it's a restorative model. And the implementation model is comprised of 4 major building blocks, 3 that you see here, and they build on one another. So there's structural supports, community building, strategic response, individualized supports. I'm going to talk about the 3 that you see here. And it's been shown to reduce the use of exclusionary discipline and increase academic functioning for kids. And I want to note that in the strategic tier 3, the strategic response component, we have a program called Developing Relational, Emotional Adaptive Minds, also known as the DREAMS program. And it's a trauma responsive intervention that's newly added to the model, because we found that even the most well-intentioned school community and school climate models fall short for kids that have greater needs. And we found that kids that were the frequent flyers or the kids that were getting in trouble the most were kids that often had trauma histories. And this felt like an injustice, and that these kids couldn't equally benefit from the relational climate that we were creating with restorative practices. And so we said, how do we fix this? And we designed this intervention. And given the high prevalence of trauma, specifically that 1/3 of kids experience one acute traumatic event before the age of 16, it has real implications for how kids are doing in school and their overall well-being. And also, when we talk about the disparities in exclusion racially, how Dr. LaSalle shared, nationally, Black students are 4 times more likely to be excluded, and students separately, independently, are also 4 times more likely to be excluded. So when we think about intersections with racism and poverty, how does this intersection impact kids of color that have trauma histories in school spaces? And so we really wanted to design this trauma responsive restorative model with these things in mind. And so if we're thinking about the way that trauma impacts the brain and how we regulate our emotions and express ourselves, kids can sometimes look like withdrawn or maybe hypervigilant. And in a lot of ways, these behaviors are misidentified as willful instances of insubordination that are met with exclusionary discipline rather than support. Because instead of understanding that these responses are appropriate and relational to their trauma histories, they're looked at as, kids are being fresh and therefore they need to be punished, which causes just more harm. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So to dig a bit deeper into each component, community building is foundational to restorative practice implementation and the JDP model. And so you want to create a community that kids don't want to harm. So this needs to feel safe and loving and like home in a lot of ways. And some of the ways that this looks in restorative models and JDP is that you have an advisory period throughout the day and you have an advisor. And the advisor is the teacher in the school that's your go-to person. So say you're having a problem with your math teacher, you go to your advisor. Say you're having a bad day, you go to your advisor. You begin to know this teacher incredibly intimately, and it becomes like a mentor to you. And it ensures that every kid has at least one supportive adult that can guide them and support them. And there's also a lot of school-wide celebrations beyond what you might see in normal school cultures. So there's a community service day where the whole school goes out with their advisor and their advisory, and they go into the community and they build up the community in whatever way that the advisory chooses. This group of students that says like, this is what we want to focus on this year. And then for holidays, there's always some sort of celebration, because sometimes kids don't celebrate outside of home, right? But you know that at school in this community, we're always going to have some sort of celebration. And so I have Boo Fest listed there, which was something done for Halloween, but for the winter holidays, there was Winterfest, and kids had a space to celebrate. And for Mother's Day, Father's Day, they had Guardian Day dinners at school where food was provided. And then another example was it was called Peace Rally. And Peace Rally was essentially a day where we coordinated with local CBOs. They came to the school, whether they were poets, actors, some sort of juvenile justice advocates, and kids would sign up for different workshops and meet with different community organizers and spend the day just kind of like learning about what exists in their community. And beyond creating this strong climate, it really is dependent on having a strong relational component within the model. So really developing strong relationships between kids and students, between kids and kids, between kids and teachers, kids and kids, and teachers and teachers. And also we're redefining power dynamics. So, sometimes kids have interactions with teachers that don't feel good. And a lot of times teachers don't always take responsibility because they feel like they don't have to. But in restorative school climates, there's space to talk about what might have happened, and for teachers to also have moments of accountability, because power dynamics are not helpful. And so there's also consideration given to race, social context, in order to build an authentic and nurturing community. And in terms of strategic response, and I think this is what people think of most when they think of restorative practices, there's this idea of healing circles and conflict mediation. And so we really try to stray away from exclusion in this model and instead create a space where kids can figure out a way to move forward in a healthy and positive way. It's a time to learn. Like, kids make mistakes, we know that. And so how can we help them learn from these mistakes instead of punishing them? Because suspension expulsions, we know they don't work. We know that they make kids do poor academically, it has negative impacts on mental health, and they're just largely decades of research show that they're ineffective. And so healing circle looks like you sit down, you talk a little bit about how you're feeling, and let's say it's a teacher in this conflict. The teacher says, like, when you were shouting in class, it made it really hard for me to teach. And then the kid shares, like, I shouted because XYZ. And then they're able to kind of come up with a solution together. And it shows that students are less likely to behave in these similar ways. So instead of excluding kids, them not learning a lesson, it gives them an opportunity to say, like, hey, maybe I see how my behavior might not have been helpful and how I can do better moving forward. Peer mentoring is having older students kind of mentor the younger students in this relational aspect, working through conflicts. Similar with mentors, there's boys groups, there's girl groups, depending on what's needed in the community, you respond to that need. And for individualized supports, we have reentry processes. So we do try to stray away from exclusion. Schools are their own beasts in a lot of ways, and some schools still are suspending, even within restorative models. But we want to make sure that when kids come back, that they know that they're welcome there, and that we're so happy that they're back, and what do they need to be supported to make sure that they're able to be a part of this community moving forward. So it's not like you get suspended and you come back and it's like, nobody wants me here, I don't belong here. It's like, okay, it happened. For whatever reason, usually it's a hands tied kind of situation because you really don't want to have any exclusion. But now that you're back, we're so happy you're here, and how can we move forward? And in the individualized supports, we also have dreams, which I mentioned earlier, and it's an 11-week curriculum designed specifically for students with higher instances of exclusion that have trauma histories. And dreams pulls from cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectic behavioral therapy. So we're talking about the relationship between thoughts, feelings, behaviors, labeling emotions, monitoring their presence, their intensity, and differentiating between them, and culturally relevant cognitive restructuring. So that means validating the injustices students might be experiencing in school and life. And sometimes that means taking action, which is not typical in normal restructuring. Maybe it means responding in some way. And then from DBT, We taught kids distress tolerance, emotion regulation, and adaptive responses, preemptive planning. So like moments that I know they're going to be really stressful, how can I plan to respond and regulate? And we tested dreams before embedding it into the JDP framework, and it was hard in a lot of ways because the schools that randomized in weren't always restorative practice communities. And so we had this mental health intervention in schools that weren't restorative. And we found that the context in which a mental health intervention is implemented is just as important as the intervention itself. So to tell you a quick story, I was I was co-designer of this program, and I went in to be one of the intervention facilitators. And it was a non-restorative school. I had sent a student to the bathroom. I didn't give her a pass. I didn't know that that was like part of the school structure. The bathroom was like really next to the classroom that I was in. And like within 5 minutes, I hear this student screaming on the top of their lungs, I want my mom, I want my mom, I want my mom. And she's hysterically crying. I step out into the hallway and she's surrounded by the principal, the assistant principal, the school security officer, and a couple teachers. And I realized that they were unable to see that this child was having a response relational to their trauma history and their experiences, and they were making it worse. And ultimately, the student was suspended for inappropriate behavior, and it was heartbreaking to me. And that's why I think it's so important to think about the context in which mental health interventions are implemented, because it's really hard to ask kids to look inside of themselves and take accountability in a community that is not safe for them. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, thank you. And so overall, students really enjoyed being a part of a trauma responsive restorative community, and we saw gains across mental health domains, behavior, cognitive, and academic outcomes. And specifically in relation to dreams, almost all the kids said that they use the skills at home and they use them at school. And I think a lot of it is just giving kids the tools that they need. And if we give them a space to regulate, maybe they won't respond in this way, but we can't expect them to use tools that they were never taught and that they're responding in ways that make sense given their histories. Most of the kids also said that they'd recommend the program to a friend that needed help with emotions or behavior. Most of the students said that it was a safe space for discussing their personal experiences. Most students said that dreams helped them with managing emotions and behavior, and all of the students said that it was something that they would want to do again. We can't hear you if you're talking to us. We're so sorry.
You're on mute, Tony.
I said that I just wanted to point out that slide to the students who are here, who are in my research class. We're gonna talk about it on Saturday.
Yeah, we got it.
So I got to say it 3 times to them in person before those of you online heard it. Thank you, Bianca.
So
Dr.
before,
Cindy.
yeah, so before I get into it, I want us to take a deep breath together, because I don't know about you all, but when I saw the picture that Dr. Lascelles showed us of the opportunity room, some stuff was turning in my stomach. And perhaps that might be the same for others in hearing just about all of the ways in which sometimes educational systems harm, um, intentionally or unintentionally, our young people and those of us that may work in those systems as well. So I just, on the count of 3, I invite you to a deep breath, because I need the deep breath, and I'll explain why I even got into this work that I'm going to share with you today. And so 1 to 3, we'll inhale together. And then if you feel comfortable, you exhale audibly or exhale through your nose. And so 1, 2, 3. Thank you. I needed that. And so I'm going to talk about healing through radical care and community care. And I'm talking about this work as it relates to self-care, right? Self-care in 2021 is, like, could we go back to the first, oh, that's the first slide, right? After. So this quote by Audre Lorde, who's a scholar, feminist, an ancestor, is caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. Now, what we heard about, the state of education, the trajectory of education, then we heard about modality that brings hope, that brings promise to young people that have experienced trauma and challenges, and those of us that work and support them. And so I'm going to talk about self-care. And in 2021, self-care became part of the NASW Code of Ethics, right? And so this is an area that for some people that have been doing the work for a long time, I'm not going to tell you years, right? I do this work because I need this work. That's why I do this work. So once upon a time, I was that burnt out social worker, bringing the work home, working in schools, devastated by the ways in which young people were being harmed by decisions, and just feeling like I wasn't doing enough. Right. And so now I'm charged to support others as they sort of move through these different ways of engaging so that they can be fully optimal in their work. Next slide. So what is self-care? So I'm gonna demystify some things, right? So self-care, it's activities or practices that we engage in on a regular basis to reduce stress and maintain or improve our health and well-being, right? What is it? It is not, right, a luxury. It is not something that we just do. Like, I did get my nails done today, right? But I can't get my nails done every week, right? I can't afford to do that every week. So it's something that it makes me feel good about myself. But for me, self-care may be that I sit for 5 minutes and do nothing, right? It's the mind, body, and soul wellness activities that we do regularly. Things like setting boundaries, right? Things like walking in nature, right? So we're going to talk about very specific examples of what self-care could look like, because some of us sometimes when we ask the question to each other, have you practiced self-care today? Sometimes we feel a little shame around it. And sometimes we beat ourselves up thinking, well, maybe I'm not doing enough for myself. But sometimes you are doing the things, you just don't name the things. And so I want to share with you a little bit about, really what is radical self-care, right? Where we are in the world right now as it relates to school-based social work, as it relates to social work, period, is that we got to get radical about how we're taking care of ourselves and, of course, how we're taking care of others. And I'll talk about community care in a little bit. But I really want to talk about like this idea of how are you being intentional and unapologetic about your well-being? What do I mean by that? I mean by like, how do you get through your day to day? If you reflected for a minute from the moment that you woke up in the morning until you rested your head on the pillow, how do you love on yourself? How do you give yourself self-compassion? How are you nourishing yourself? Are you getting enough water? Are you getting enough nourishing food that will engage your body in a positive way, right? I was just thinking I hadn't sipped on my water yet, right? That's an area of growth for me, is that's why I have this. So what I do with my water bottles, I actually put affirmations on my water bottle. Because for me, when I'm drinking water, I'm also reminding myself, I get to read an affirmation on my water bottle, because that's a way that I engage with my mind self-care, is that I get to remind myself that I'm courageous. I get to remind myself that I love myself. I get to remind myself that I could restart right now, even if I didn't make the best food choices today, that I could start right now with this little bit of water that I'm going to drink, right? It's an act of resistance, especially when, unfortunately, when I started doing internships and in social work, those supervisors that I had, they ran themselves down. They didn't take lunch. They would come into work looking a hot mess. And I thought to myself, that's not the kind of social worker that I want to be. Like, what is that about? Right. And so I am that act of resistance in all my places of employment where I make sure I'm taking lunch. I make sure that I'm setting boundaries and limits and acknowledging that it's not easy to do that. And it takes practice, right? This is over 2 decades of doing this work and making mistakes. I love that. Bianca said, kids make mistakes. We know that. And guess what? We make mistakes too, right? And we get to acknowledge that. And it's the beyond surface level wellness. This is not, this is like, are you making sure that you're getting what you need, right? Are you making sure that you're getting the healing that is necessary? Perhaps it's professional therapy. Perhaps it's medical care that you've been avoiding. Perhaps it's engaging in healing spaces. Perhaps it's reconnecting with your spiritual development. Perhaps it's nurturing friendship and communities that you've been neglecting because you're busy, because we're so busy being busy and working and doing the work for everybody else. But then what happens to us, right? Boundary setting. I could do a whole day workshop on boundary setting, both professional and personal. I'm the youngest of 7. I grew up in a Dominican household, first generation. And with that, I said it all, right? The youngest had to do all the things. And so I learned how to set boundaries by life experience, but also through professional development, learning that there are ways of communicating that is assertive, nurturing, yet direct, right? Understanding that that is also part of self-care when you're being asked to take on additional work that you really could say no, but because you're the one that says yes, they always go to you first, right? Like that's just like an example of how that shows up. Collective healing and community care. Are you making investments in collective healing and community care? Congratulations to those of you that showed up either online or in person. It takes a lot. I know that the weather's getting a little bit warm. I'm in New York. It's a little warmer here, but it's still a little cool, right? So sometimes it takes extra effort to get up and create community in spaces, right? Part of the work that I get to do outside of my academic work is I create retreats for social workers. We're having one in March. In March 21st through the 23rd. And those retreat spaces were intentional because that's what I needed when I was a school social worker. That was what I needed when I was in that work because I was so isolated in the work that I was doing on a day-to-day. So are you being intentional about creating those spaces for yourself? And if you're that leader that loves to bring people together, perhaps you're the one that creates that space for others, right? And making sure that you're taking yourself in the care of yourself in the process. I love that we talked about advocacy, that Dr. LaSalle talked about advocacy, and Bianca talked about advocacy, and so did Dr. De Jesus. Structural change advocacy is so much part of radical self-care. I'm a social work educator, but I always say I'm a micro, meso, macro social worker, right? I get engaged in all the things, and I get it. I love the social work students that come into graduate school or undergraduate experience and say, I want to be a therapist. I want to support the folks one-on-one, and that's amazing and fantastic. We need all of that. And I do all the things. I'm the therapist. I do the group work. I do the macro work and all the things. And we also need to call our legislative leaders, right? We need to be involved. We need to be engaged. We need to be aware. We need to find out what are you, if you're part of a community board, or do you know what's happening in your neighborhood? Do you know what's happening within your union? If you're part of a union in your places of employment, are there things that need to be said in those meetings? Do you need to build the courage to say those things, right? What does that look like? How can you educate yourself in creating the way of being to talk in those spaces? Some of us may come from communities and histories and backgrounds where we may not have had the confidence to talk about the things that are inequitable or to talk about systems that need to be disrupted. I definitely was that student that did not talk in class at all. So for me to be doing this is like huge. People that know me, they're like, you're doing what? Right? And it was because I built community and I got the tools I needed to be in this space, right? I'm definitely not going to be the one that's going to be at a march, because for me, energetically, that just doesn't work for me. It's too much anxiety for me. But I'll do this. I'll be in New York, zooming into a meeting and sharing with y'all these tools, right? And we also get to reclaim rest and restoration. Like this whole idea of grind culture, we get to disrupt it, right? What time are we shutting down that computer? You know, this, I did not have this phone thing when I was in graduate school. I don't know how y'all are doing it, right? Every 2 minutes, we're like on our phones. We need to figure out, what does rest look like? And how do we set boundaries for ourselves so that we are engaging in the rest? Next slide. So what does it look like in action, right? Whenever I lead any kind of meeting, if I'm the one that's the leader, I always engage in some kind of grounding exercise. It could be like a quick breath, like I just did with y'all, so that we could kind of start in the same place together. For others, it might be, tell me a highlight of your day, right? Something as simple as that could really set that community that Bianca was talking about. I am a mindfulness facilitator and I do breath work. And so I do that for myself every day, sometimes several times a day, depending on some meetings, maybe longer than the 5 minutes. It could be a 30-minute situation, right? Journaling for me, it's actually an evidence-based practice that people don't often talk about. You know, I've actually created journals. I use journaling in my work, and that's something that you could incorporate into your day-to-day experiences to support your mind, body, and soul wellness. Again, I'm going to say it again because somebody needs to hear it. Setting boundaries. I don't know who needs to hear it again, but we'll say it again. Curating joy. I'm going to say that again. Curating joy. What does joy look like for you? I talk with many students and they're like, I don't have time for that. I don't have time. I got to read this. I got to read that. And I will say to you that when you incorporate joy, connection, fun, even if that's like 10 minutes a week, even that's like you put on your favorite jam and you dance in your living room, it makes room for more creativity. It makes room for more grounding and more focus. And so I invite you, if you're not curating joy, figure out what that looks like for you. Physical movement. What does that look like? Walking, yoga. It looks like I'm not the one that's going to run a marathon, but I will dance bachata for 30 minutes in my living room and salsa, right? That's what I'm going to definitely do. Time blocking is a strategy, right? Where there's certain days that I'm going to do certain things so that my brain could know that that's the day that I do the thing, right? That works for some people. That definitely is a way to self-care, because then you are setting boundaries around your energy and your time. And then again, what does advocating for just policies look like for you? For some people, it might be making phone calls, writing emails, going to your local politician's office, volunteering on a board, doing this kind of work, creating communities for others. Next slide. So let's talk about community care. Community care is just as essential as self-care. And I know that some people, when they hear self-care, they're like, oh my gosh, there goes that word again. And how dare the NASW put that in the code of ethics when these organizations don't know how to treat us? And that's like with an exclamation point. And so community care is so essential when you think about the collective well-being of who we are. Even creating this space, that Stowe Center said that this topic was such an important topic that we're going to create this space for folks to come virtually and in person to have these kinds of discussions, right? So essential. I believe that healing happens in connection. There's nothing that I do that's not in community. I always have accountability groups for so many different parts of my life, right? Thinking about restorative support networks. Some people use social media for that. Thinking about, what does interdependence mean? You know, we can't create communities in schools without working with the educators, without working with the administrators, without working with the superintendents, right? Without working with all of the individuals that make the decisions. And I love the work that y'all talked about earlier about the peer mentorship and the advocacy work. Again, I'm going to say it again. Boundary setting, we're going to say it again. Sometimes the community that y'all are part of we get to release our energy and time around those communities. Sometimes we all have developed communities that are not necessarily caring communities and could be toxic communities. And that's part of the self-care too, is releasing yourself from communities that no longer support you, are no longer supporting your mind, body, and soul wellness. Thinking about what the restorative practices look like for you within yourself and your community and your own families, right? As you move into these various communities within schools, right? And then of course, how are we uplifting one another in this space? I love, like Dr. De Jesus, I met him when I was just thinking about being in a doctoral program. I was in a school, as a school social worker, I went to a training at Hunter and I met him there and we started chatting. Next thing you know, we're chatting about maybe I'll do a doctorate. I don't know. I'm not sure I could do it. He was like, I think you could do it. Then I met his wife. And then I was like, oh, I could definitely do this. And now here we are, years later, and we get to collaborate and uplift one another, right? He came to do a keynote with his wife at Columbia School of Social Work when I was coordinating school social work conferences. And that was the way that I decided I would build community in a space that wasn't necessarily creating that for me. And so I definitely want to leave you with that. Next slide. I think that's it. Right? Is that it? Yeah, that's it. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, we can't hear you, Tony.
How about now? Great. So as I was listening to Cindy, it all, you know, the micro, meso, macro kind of came to me. And I'll give a shout out to our colleague Heath Hightower and his individual and context model, which is a broader way to think about the micro, meso, macro. When I was a school social worker, I experienced secondary trauma. I had lots of symptoms and I had difficulty setting boundaries. I was in a school that was a very toxic environment because we were manning and womaning and peopling the opportunity room and managing the elaborate behavior management system that controlled kids' bodies in the name of educating them, right? When I started my own doctoral journey, I was drawn to an article called The Prevention of Violence, the Production of Docile Bodies by Pedro Noguera, who would become my dissertation advisor. He's the dean at the USC School of Education. And that, more than anything, spoke to me because it gave me context for understanding the system within which I was working, which I did not understand before I started working, because education or schooling had worked for me, more or less, but enough that I got to an MSW program and got out of an MSW program and had a passion for working with young people, and I saw the possibilities in schools. And so the school social work role appealed to me. I know it appeals to many MSW students and many MSW aspirants. But make no mistake, schools, as Dr. Lascelles pointed out, are within a larger set of structures that are not organized to support all students. And one of the really important things that I learned when you reference Brown versus Board of Education, Brown versus Board of Education sought to desegregate public schools in this country, which was a very important thing. And it's spoken about as de jure segregation versus, or desegregation versus de facto. In fact, we are still segregated. And what Brown versus Board of Education did not accomplish was to desegregate the communities within which we live. And as Heather pointed out, the way that we fund public schooling, and it's also connected to a system of private schooling that that does not distribute educational opportunity equally across geographic boundaries, cities and towns, right? And what you have access to and what you bring with you from your first educators, your family and your community at home. How is that engaged by the school setting that you're in? So all these things are things that I knew very little about when I entered schools as a school social worker. I also remember when my BSW policy professor talked about social workers as agents of social control. And I really didn't understand what that meant, because I thought I wanted to be an agent of social change. I thought social workers were agents of social change. And then a couple of years later, I'm working in the opportunity room, which was called the planning center in the school I worked in. And I was trained in nonviolent physical restraints, and I'm actually there literally controlling kids' bodies, right? And so I think that what I've come to learn, I think what our panel has also demonstrated, especially with Bianca's presentation on restorative justice and evidence-based practices related to restoration, resilience, addressing trauma in schools, is that as social workers, as school social workers, we can be agents of social control, or we can be agents of social change. And every day we have a choice to make in this regard. I think what Cindy has shared with us is that it's essential for us to see our ability to be agents of social change in schools and out of schools as being connected to restoring and caring for ourselves in a context of caring for our community. And in that context, then school social workers can contribute to making schools learning communities that care. This connects back to my earlier research in education research around critical care, or the idea that care or caring is rooted in a critical analysis of the conditions under which students learn. So I want to, I guess, end my my comments in terms of bringing this all together before with that and open it up for questions and responses.
Makes me think when we think about caring for communities is that it requires us as social workers, and maybe this is me kind of leaning on the history again, to recognize and acknowledge that institutions have been those systems of social control and surveillance for many people and families. And recognizing that, and recognizing that there's not just trust just because I work in a school and have the badge and say I'm a social worker. And so part of our job is not only working with those people that are in the schools, the students, the teachers, but is to heal the community, right? And be able to bring community together and to be able to acknowledge that the education system has been harmful, as have other institutions and systems, right, within our government, and acknowledging that for individuals and validating and hearing their stories, and then building slowly on trust. And some of that comes with food and felt safety and creating spaces where people feel heard and that they belong and bringing people together. And over time, we can work to heal communities. So I feel very strongly that that's some of our role as social workers, is it's not just about Johnny that's in the classroom, but it's about that entire community and how we can help to bridge the family and recognizing, you know, that the school is a space where we build relationships.
Guillermo.
Thank you. This was very stimulating and also a bit overwhelming. I'm wondering, in the context in which we are now, when the Department of Education will be led by somebody who was in charge of the WWE, where the model is pretty much causing trauma, not remediating trauma. And when there's a possibility that kids will be captured and deported from the school systems. And that is to be, let's say, allowed. Thinking of the macro. How do we think of this model? Of creating safe spaces, of thinking of restorative justice, perhaps, even before a certain contract is violated, of safety and nurturing community or caring community. But what are your thoughts? Is there hope?
I'll say that it's not compatible with restorative justice. It's a completely retributive justice and punitive approach and model, so they're not really compatible. And it just underscores the challenge that we're enduring, that we're experiencing, and that you know, one of my first education policy classes, the Department of Education, the Federal Department of Education, the Hartford Board of Education, every local school district, that school structures are this professor that I had, Dick Elmore, said are the congealed residue of political battles fought outside of schools. So politics, one way to think about it is the nonviolent resolution of conflict, and professional wrestling is the performance of violent resolution of conflict, and perhaps you know, there's a what we need a restorative version of WWE. But I'm not exactly sure how we would accomplish that. But what I'm trying to illustrate is that they're not compatible, and that there's that part of the political struggle moving forward, and that may be part of realistically might be part of rebuilding what remains of the Department of Education. When we have that opportunity, would be to really infuse restorative approaches and think about structures that are really responsive to the needs of children and communities. But certainly we are prepared to be enduring a lot more trauma, a lot more conflict.
If I could add to that
Yeah.
question, I think that it's a wonderful question, because what I'm also hearing is like, you know, despite the system being broken and there being a lot of barriers to creating like truly restorative safe spaces right now, what do we do given that this is happening? Like, how do we really create a restorative school given that like kids can be ripped out? And I think that that's a really important question, because the truth is, what do we do, right? Like right now, what do we do? And I think part of that is, in restorative models, as I mentioned earlier, we want to respond to the needs that kids have. And so right now, if you have undocumented kids in restorative spaces, you're organizing with your school communities. How do we protect our kids? What if ICE shows up on our door? We have a lot of undocumented kids. What do we do to connect them with legal resources where they provide free aid if it comes up? Like, you're planning and preparing in a restorative community. And I know that you're saying, or maybe thinking like, this sounds like a big job for a school teacher or school social worker, but in a holistic restorative school model, you are looking at the whole kid and the whole climate in which the kid exists outside of the school. And the truth is, right now, there is a lot of fear for a lot of kids in the community that I worked in, right? And all over the country. And so how are we responding to that direct need? And the truth is, like, a lot of people are scared and don't know what to do, but you do your best to advocate to respond to the needs that your kids have. And it may not always be like foolproof or fail safe, and it may not, but you do what you can to advocate in a really scary world that we live in right now to ensure their safety as best as you can.
Thank you. Dr. Bautista Tomas.
So I'm sorry I can't see the person who just made that statement. Thank you so much for that. I want to tap into when you said, thank you for this, and I feel overwhelmed. There's an intentionality about what we're experiencing. This is collective trauma. And I think it's so essential that we name it. So thank you for naming what some of us may be feeling, right? And what I will share is that each of us is equipped with a skill set, a gift, talent, and ability that is necessary for such a time as this, right? That's why it's so important that we figure out how we could ground ourselves in who we are, what our gift set is, what are our talents, and what do we bring to the table? Because we cannot do it all. We cannot. Some of us will be the writers. Some of us will be the ones in the marches. Others of us will be doing that one-on-one individual support with our families. Some of us will be writing those books and articles and teaching the next generation of social workers, or some of us are healers. So we get to figure out, what role can I play in this space while still honoring who I am, because we cannot give from a deficit place. We have to give from our overflow. And this is where sometimes as social workers, we struggle, because so many of us come to this work because of past situations we've experienced so that we could pay it forward. And then we forget to pay ourselves first, right? And so I invite us all in the space to figure out what that is for us, right? The other night, last week, I did a free grounding space for the community, because I know that's a gift that I have. I felt called to do it. And I think 12 people showed up, 10, I don't know. But guess what? I got a couple of emails, and people like, that was exactly what I needed. And I know that that's a space that I get to create. And so while we acknowledge the overwhelm, acknowledge the things that are happening, we could hold both, right? And figure out what that looks like for us and how we get into it.
As social workers, just one more thing. As social workers, we are so different than a lot of other educators, psychologists, counselors, teachers, in that part of our professional duty is political participation. We are called to that ethically. And so thinking about mobilizing, supporting, educating those that we are working with, empowering people to feel as though they have a voice, especially marginalized communities that feel like nobody wants to hear my story or cares about me, right? And so if you can start with, I care about you, right? And your story is important, and we are going to call or write an email. And we see, just in regards to gun violence, which is dear to me, having worked in Newtown and, with Sandy Hook families, and also having a friend's child who died as a result of gun violence in schools. We've seen youth mobilize. We've seen what they can do and how powerful they're on Good Morning America, and how they can turn tragedy into greatness. And so being able to inspire that in young people, they're the ones that are, and in their families and in their communities, to feel as though their voices matter. because I believe that there's more people, right, that don't want the WWE to take over our education system. But they just don't know what to do, and I think are paralyzed in all of this trauma that my fellow panelists spoke of.
Aaliyah and Nash, could you each share your question or comment? And then if anybody online has a question or comment, if you can post it in the chat.
So I spent a few years working for community schools. So for those who don't know, community schools are typically schools that work with usually an outside partnership. So for myself, it was the Village for Families and Children. Sometimes it's like Catholic Charities. Just specifically for Hartford, there's lots more. But I think my question is not really a question, but how do you guys feel about community school? Because I spent 8 years working with one. While, for example, Bianca shared that in her school or wherever it was, sorry, not to say specifically, they did like the fatherhood, mom, guardianship days, etc., all these events. And that was funded by the district. In the school I was at, it was funded by me. I had to meet every 2 or 3 weeks, or like, we want to do this event. What can you guys provide? Well, we can do the food, we can do this, we can do this, we can do this. You know, I understood, you know, the importance of this, but a lot of the times it was seen as like you know, like just like a bank account. And that's where, I guess like some of the difficulties in community schools in inner city communities, which is also the only place that typically has community schools. So I just want to hear a little bit more about like your thoughts and, cause you know that if you guys ever look into it, community schools, I think are awesome. But just, you know, just wanted to talk a little bit more about that. If possible.
Sure. Aaliyah.
I guess I have more of a comment, maybe question. Looking at the pictures provided today during the presentation of how these planning or opportunity rooms look like, it brought up just experiences from my past growing up. I went to school right down the street from here at West Middle. My planning room, my social worker looked just like that. It was looked like a dormitory rather than a room that I was able to go into and feel safe. Going to a magnet school after that, you see the difference. And I'm wondering if funding and how as social workers, we could advocate for our students to get more funding to have better atmospheres to put our kids so they can feel comfortable talking. In the magnet school, it was a sensory room / mindfulness center where I went in with the social worker, sat there, they had different textures on the wall, a ball pit, just so you could be able to go in there and relax. And you don't get that in many public schools versus the magnet school. So I guess my question would be, how do we advocate with the Board of Education to get that for our students?
Well, I'll give that a shot. I guess like Hamilton, I'm not throwing away my shot. You know, I think that if you think about that in terms of magnet schools didn't exist at a certain point. That magnet schools are the result of a concerted organizing effort that led to legislation, I believe, right? I'm not from Connecticut, but I think about that in terms of work I've also done in New York, that there's no meaningful reform in education that wasn't the result of efforts of organizing, that people identified a need, that there was conflict over what that need was, and it played itself out in the WWE of the political process of decision makers at the city, the state, the federal level, deciding this is how we're gonna respond to that problem. And almost never, I think this speaks to maybe Nash's point, is that while it addresses a need that was not addressed before, it almost never completely addresses that need in the way that it's defined or understood by that community, right? And so that is that's kind of an everlasting challenge in that regard, right? So how do we then continue to improve upon the shortcomings in the responses that we have, right? So I think this is where I'll come back to Bianca's presentation, and perhaps she might comment, right? But I think it's really through generating a body of evidence in terms of what works. How do restorative practices work? How do community schools address needs that traditional school structures are not addressing, right? And what is the cost? And how do we then reallocate or allocate the resources, right? So this is all, I think, the micro, meso, macro approach to thinking about these problems.
Yeah, I
So
can
the
add,
tensions, sorry, Bianca. Okay, the tensions in resources, are intentional. They're intentional. We know just, here in Hartford, there was recently an Office of Child Advocate report of how many young, particularly Black and brown boys, and it was students in my class had read the High Roads report, that are bused to Wallingford every day, where there's unlicensed teachers, where they're restrained and secluded at extremely high rates. And it's at a cost of nearly $100,000 or more per student. That's more than a Harvard education tuition wise. So if we can find the money to respond to students in that way, we can definitely afford some squishy balls and Play-Doh. It's just about how we are responding and who we are responding to, because we also know, thinking about gun violence, right? It's not Black and brown boys that are shooting schools up. But we don't see metal detectors in my hometown of Cheshire looking at these young men that are going into schools, right, at the risk. We do see an investment in metal detectors here at Buckley High School and at police officers in schools. So what is that message? It's a much larger and systemic issue that we have to, I think, bring our voices to the table. And thankfully, I think our senators really are strong advocates to bring mental health into schools, to look at, taking police out of schools and reutilizing that money, reallocating it towards mental health services and what it is communicating to students. The little girl that attended the school with the opportunity room had to walk through a metal detector every day. Kindergartners and preschoolers were walking through metal detectors. That's hard to grapple with. Sorry, Bianca.
no, that's okay. I just wanted to quickly, I want to be mindful of the time because I'm sure folks have full lives. So I'm just going to really quickly say that I appreciated that you both mentioned community schools and these regulation spaces, and all of the restorative the schools that we are in Pittsburgh we call them chill rooms or calm down corners, and it sounds very similar. But based on what Dr. Jesús was saying is like, do we have the evidence to show that this is effective to make this change? And then to like invest in making this change. And then also the community school aspect. So I also started as a social worker, as mentioned, and it was a restorative school and a community school together. And it was one of the most beautiful things that I've ever seen. And so thinking about building research to show what's effective, to show like better, I feel like schools really care about scores, how kids are performing. We can show that having community schools and investing in restorative practices improves academic functioning. I think we can begin to get boards and stakeholders and folks on board to say like, hey, this is a good idea. So all that to say, like, having the research to support these changes and show that they're effective, utilizing different models, so multi-tiered interventions, whether that's mental health interventions with restorative practices, with school-based community models, like whatever it takes, you explore and you build and you expand to find safe spaces for kids. Sorry, I tried to make that a minute or so, and I think I did okay.
Thank you. Does anyone online have a question or comment?
That kind of radical progressive movement, right, in the education journey or history, it has us think about where we are in today's context. And what is it that we want to come out of schools? Do we want empathetic, emotionally intelligent human beings that can have relationships and communicate with each other, or do we want someone that can, do math and memorize facts? And is that where we are in the world right now, that those are the things that are most important, especially in the day and age where we all walk around with a computer at our fingertips. So I think that we really need to look at the education system and decide, and social workers know what the needs are, and we know, like, we see the environment, and we are really positioned to be able to advocate for those changes. It's about creating communities, networking, joining school social workers of America, NASW, creating groups so that we can advocate together and you're not feeling alone in this process.
I wonder if Dr. Bautista Tomas might close us out with a reflection or grounding
Absolutely.
experience.
Thank you for the invitation to close us out. So at this time, I don't see who's in the room. And I still feel your amazing energy, right? That y'all came out on I like to call it Thursday night, Friday Junior. On a Friday Junior, you could have been doing anything else, but you're here with us. And so I invite you at this time, if it feels comfortable and it's available to you, so please uncross your legs if they're crossed. If there's anything in your hands, I invite you to place your hands wherever it's comfortable on your lap, on either side of your body. I also invite you to kind of maybe shrug your shoulders a little bit. We've been sitting for about an hour and a half, some of us more. I invite you also to either lower your gaze or find a focus point somewhere in the room. If you feel even more comfortable, you can close your eyes. So I wanted to kind of lift up that this is Social Work Month, right? As we gather today, I invite you to inhale and exhale through your nose. If you would like to take a deep breath as you inhale, allow your belly to fully fill up with air. And we'll just take some deep breaths, however way it's natural to you. And so as we gather today, I wanted to just take a moment to acknowledge and honor each and every one of you that are here today, whether you're online or in person, not just for the work that you do, but for the heart and dedication that you bring to it every single day. This is a month to celebrate the impact of our profession, but also a time to reflect on how we care for ourselves and the process of serving others. You spend so much time holding space for others that right now I just want to just create this little bit of couple of moments of connection for yourselves. We're going to take 3 intentional breaths together. We're going to be breathing in renewal, exhaling stress and heaviness. And so I invite you to inhale deeply through your nose for a count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold for 1, 2, and exhale for 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. Again, inhale for 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold 1, 2, and exhale for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The last time, we're breathing in renewal, exhaling stress and heaviness. Inhale 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold for 1, 2. Exhale 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I invite you to connect with your breath. Open your eyes if you had them closed. Welcome you back into the space. And thank you so much for taking on that invitation. And thank you, each of you, for being here tonight and for allowing me to guide you through this practice. Thank you so much.
All the panelists, as well as everyone who was able to join us here and online for these really important conversations. So thank you for your insight, everything you had to share with us. Thank you for spending time with us here at the Stowe Center. I do hope that you'll keep in touch. We have more programs online as well as in person. I'm doing more with hybrid, which is always a little scary and feels like a wild card, but I think it opens up opportunities like this when I feel like we just got this amazing interaction between like 3 universities all coming together, which is pretty unique and very special. So thank you also, Tony, for really being the driving force in organizing this. Thank you, Heather, Cindy, Bianca, for being here. Have a wonderful night, and I hope you can keep in touch. And actually, speaking of social workers, in our gallery in the house, the Gallery for Hope and Freedom, we happen to have an art installation by a local social worker, Mrs. Carol Washington. So it's got some really special pieces in there, fabric art, as well as paintings. So we're trying to offer many opportunities to engage with the arts, with history, with current events and our current political situations, and grapple with it all together in a community.
Thank you.
So again, thank you so much for being here. I hope to see you again soon, and don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions, comments, suggestions. Love to hear it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Good night.